June 4, 1942, 0430 hours. Kido Butai Strike Force northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commands 4 fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi leads the 2nd Carrier Division from his flagship Hiryu, where 108 aircraft prepare to obliterate American defenses and draw the Pacific Fleet into a decisive trap that will secure Japanese dominance across the Pacific Ocean. The morning air hung thick with salt spray and the acrid smell of aviation fuel as deck crews swarmed across the flight decks of Japan's most powerful naval formation. The sound of Nakajima Sakae engines warming to life mixing with the rhythmic crash of waves against steel hulls as the 4 carriers of the Kido Butai cut through the dark Pacific waters at 24 knots, their wakes trailing behind them like white scars across the ocean's surface. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge wing of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the organized chaos below, where aviation ordnancemen wheeled Type 99 No. 80 Mark V armor-piercing bombs toward waiting Aichi D3A dive bombers, while torpedo mechanics made final adjustments to the Type 91 aerial torpedo slung beneath the bellies of Nakajima B5N attack planes. Each aircraft representing months of training and years of tactical development that had made the Imperial Japanese Navy the most feared naval aviation force in the world. The pre-dawn darkness was broken by the red glow of position lights as flight deck officers guided the first wave of aircraft into position. 18 Aichi D3A Type 99 dive bombers from Hiryu taking their places alongside 9 Mitsubishi A6M Type 0 fighters, their pilots already strapped into cockpits and running through final instrument checks while deck crews pulled wheel chocks and prepared for what Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had promised would be the decisive blow that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific and force the United States to negotiate a favorable peace that would leave Japan's newly conquered empire intact. Yamaguchi felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always came before battle, the mixture of anticipation and responsibility that had driven him through every engagement since Pearl Harbor, where his carrier division had helped deliver the surprise attack that brought America into the war and set the stage for 6 months of unbroken Japanese victories across the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Joichi Tominaga, leading the strike force from his position in A-B5N Cape Bomber, raised his hand to signal readiness as deck crews completed their final checks. The 1,000-horsepower Nakajima Sakae radial engines of the strike aircraft creating a thunderous roar that could be heard across the water to the other 3 carriers, where similar scenes were playing out as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu prepared their own contributions to the 108 aircraft armada that would reduce Midway's defenses to rubble and clear the way for the invasion force following behind. The tactical brilliance of the plan was evident in its simplicity. Destroy Midway's air power, eliminate the atoll's ability to threaten Japanese shipping lanes, and force the American Pacific Fleet to emerge from Pearl Harbor into the carefully prepared killing zone where Admiral Yamamoto waited with the combined fleet's battleships and cruisers, ready to complete the destruction that Japan's carrier aircraft would begin. Yamaguchi turned his attention to the tactical display in the bridge, where intelligence officers had plotted the estimated positions of American forces based on radio intercepts and reconnaissance reports, the small flags and symbols representing what Japanese naval intelligence believed to be a weak and demoralized enemy force that had been steadily retreating since the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The confidence that permeated every level of Japanese naval command was built on an unbroken string of victories that had seen Japanese forces capture Wake Island, devastate the Dutch East Indies, humiliate the British Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, and establish a defensive perimeter that stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands, creating what military planners called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and what realistic assessments showed to be the largest maritime empire in human history. The signal flags broke out across the carrier formation as Admiral Nagumo's staff coordinated the launch sequence, the 4 carriers turning into the wind to provide the additional airspeed needed for heavily loaded aircraft to achieve takeoff velocity, their massive hulls cutting through the swells with the practiced precision of a formation that had operated together since the Pearl Harbor attack and had developed the kind of tactical cohesion that only came from months of continuous operations. Flight deck crews wore different colored jerseys to identify their specialties. Red for ordnance handlers, purple for aviation fuel teams, blue for aircraft handlers, green for catapult and arresting gear crews, yellow for flight deck directors, and brown for plane captains, each color representing a critical link in the complex chain of operations that could put more than 400 aircraft into the air from a single formation in less than 2 hours. As the first aircraft of the strike force began their takeoff rolls, the distinctive whine of centrifugal superchargers mixed with the deeper rumble of reduction gearboxes as 18-cylinder radial engines strained to lift bomb-laden aircraft off flight decks that rose and fell with the ocean swells, each successful takeoff bringing the Japanese force one step closer to what Admiral Yamamoto had described as the decisive battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. The Aichi D3A dive bombers climbed away from their carriers with 250-kilogram general-purpose bombs or 242-kilogram semi-armor-piercing bombs, their fixed landing gear creating additional drag but providing the structural strength needed for the violent pullouts that characterized dive bombing attacks, while the Nakajima B5N level bombers carried either Type 91 Model 3 aerial torpedoes or 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval gun shells. Yamaguchi watched through binoculars as the strike formation began to take shape above the carrier force, the various squadrons from the 4 carriers joining into a massive aerial armada that represented the concentrated striking power of Japan's most elite naval aviation units, crews that had trained together for years and had proven their effectiveness in battle after battle across the Pacific, from the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor to the devastating raids that had driven British naval forces from the Indian Ocean and secured Japanese control over the vital shipping lanes that connected the home islands to the conquered territories in Southeast Asia. The sight of so many aircraft in formation was both inspiring and sobering, a visible reminder of the enormous investment in men and materials that Japan had committed to this operation and the equally enormous consequences that would follow from either success or failure. The radio crackled with reports from the strike force as they climbed to attack altitude and set course for Midway, Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's convoys providing navigation updates and weather observations while squadron leaders confirmed their formations and checked their radio frequencies, the professional competence evident in every transmission a reflection of the years of training that had produced what many observers considered to be the finest naval aviation force in the world. Japanese pilot training emphasized not just individual flying skills but the kind of coordinated attacks that could overwhelm enemy defenses through precise timing and mutual support, with dive bombers arriving first to suppress anti-aircraft guns and draw defending fighters into position where torpedo bombers could exploit gaps in the defensive screen. As the strike force disappeared into the distance, heading southeast toward their target, Yamaguchi turned his attention to the combat air patrol that circled overhead, 9 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters from his own carrier providing top cover for the Kido Butai, while similar patrols from the other 3 carriers created interlocking defensive zones that extended out to 30 nautical miles from the formation. The Zero fighters represented the pinnacle of Japanese aeronautical engineering, aircraft that combined exceptional maneuverability with impressive range and firepower, their 7.7mm machine guns and 20mm cannons capable of destroying any American fighter that had yet appeared in Pacific skies, while their 1,200-mile combat radius allowed them to escort bombers to targets that other nations could only reach with unescorted aircraft. The tactical situation board in Hiryu's bridge showed the positions of Japanese forces spread across thousands of square miles of ocean, with the main striking force centered on the 4 fleet carriers, supported by 2 battleships of the Kongo class, 3 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, while additional forces approached from different vectors to create the kind of multi-axis threat that Japanese naval doctrine had perfected through years of war games and exercises. The northern force under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya was simultaneously attacking Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention away from the Central Pacific, while the transport group under Vice Admiral Nobite Kondo followed several hundred miles behind the carriers, ready to land 5,000 troops on Midway once the airstrikes had eliminated resistance. Admiral Yamamoto himself remained with the main body of the combined fleet, positioned 300 miles northwest of the carrier force with the battleships Yamato, Nagato, and Matsu, ready to engage whatever elements of the American Pacific Fleet emerged from Pearl Harbor to defend Midway, their 18.1-inch and 16-inch main guns capable of destroying any American battleship at ranges exceeding 25 miles. While their accompanying cruisers and destroyers provided additional firepower and screening capability. The complexity of the operation reflected both the ambitious scope of Japanese strategic planning and the confidence that came from 6 months of uninterrupted success against enemies who had consistently failed to match Japanese tactical innovation and operational effectiveness. At 0552 hours, the radio room aboard Hiryu received the first indication that the morning might not proceed according to plan, when communications intercept equipment picked up an uncoded American transmission reporting 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 degrees. Distance 180 miles, course 135, speed 25. A message that could only mean that American reconnaissance aircraft had located the Japanese force and were reporting its position to commanders who were supposed to be caught. Completely by surprise, Yamaguchi felt the first stirring of unease as he studied the message transcript, recognizing that the precise nature of the American report suggested a level of preparedness that contradicted intelligence estimates of weak and demoralized enemy forces caught off guard by the Japanese approach. The implications of early detection began to multiply as staff officers calculated time-distance factors and defensive possibilities, realizing that if American forces on Midway had been alerted to the Japanese approach, they would have time to prepare their defenses and possibly even launch preemptive strikes against the carrier force before the Japanese bombers could complete their mission. The carefully orchestrated timeline that depended on achieving tactical surprise was already beginning to unravel, though the full extent of American preparedness would not become apparent until later events revealed that United States Navy cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes and provided Admiral Chester Nimitz with detailed advanced knowledge of Japanese plans, including target locations, force compositions, and attack timing. Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's voice came over the radio as the strike force approached their target, reporting excellent visibility and weak defensive reactions as they began their bombing runs on Midway's Eastern Island and Sand Island installations, the lack of significant air-to-air opposition initially suggesting that the Americans had indeed been caught unprepared despite their early warning. The strike aircraft methodically worked over their assigned targets, with dive bombers attacking fuel storage facilities, aircraft hangars, and anti-aircraft gun positions while level bombers concentrated on the airfield runways and administrative buildings. Their attacks creating the kind of spectacular explosions and fires that had characterized successful Japanese airstrikes throughout the Pacific campaign. But even as the attack proceeded, troubling reports began filtering back from the strike force commander, who observed that while significant damage was being inflicted on Midway's facilities, many American aircraft had managed to take off before the attack arrived, and the island's defensive installations were proving more resilient than expected. The concrete runways showed damage from bomb hits but remained partially operational, while anti-aircraft fire continued throughout the attack, suggesting that Midway's defenders had not been caught completely unprepared and retained significant capability to interfere with Japanese operations. More ominously, American aircraft were observed launching from the island even as the Japanese attack continued, indicating that Midway's airfield remained functional despite the bombing. At 0700 hours, Tomonaga transmitted the message that would trigger the first critical decision point of the battle. There is need for a second attack wave, a recommendation that reflected his professional assessment that the first strike had damaged but not eliminated Midway's ability to threaten Japanese operations. The request created an immediate tactical dilemma for Admiral Nagumo, who had held back 93 aircraft as a reserve force to deal with any American naval units that might appear, these aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and aerial torpedoes specifically designed for attacks on ships rather than the general-purpose bombs needed for a second strike on land targets. Yamaguchi had anticipated this moment and had already formed his opinion about the correct course of action, his aggressive temperament and tactical instincts leading him to favor immediate offensive action against any American forces that might threaten the carrier force. But the decision rested with Admiral Nagumo as overall commander of the Kido Butai, and Nagumo's more cautious approach to command decisions reflected both his seniority and his responsibility for the safety of Japan's most valuable naval assets. The debate that followed would be analyzed by military historians for decades afterward, as the decision to rearm the reserve aircraft with land attack weapons created vulnerabilities that American forces would exploit with devastating effect. The process of changing ordnance loads was inherently time-consuming and dangerous, requiring deck crews to carefully remove torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from aircraft and replace them with general-purpose bombs and incendiaries suitable for attacking land targets, while aviation fuel lines had to be connected to top-off tanks that had been partially emptied to reduce fire hazards during the first wave launch. The complexity of carrier operations meant that such changes could not be accomplished quickly, even by the highly trained crews of the Kido Butai, and the process required virtually the entire air group to be moved from the flight deck to the hangar deck, where ordnance changes could be made without interfering with the combat air patrol operations that were essential for defending the carriers against attack. As Japanese ordnance crews began the laborious process of rearming the reserve aircraft, American planes from Midway began appearing on the radar screens of escorting cruisers and destroyers, the first waves of attacking aircraft representing a mixture of obsolescent types that included Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters, Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, Vought SB-2U Vindicator scout bombers, and even Army Air Force's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers pressed into anti-shipping roles for which they had never been designed. The appearance of attacking aircraft forced Japanese carriers to begin evasive maneuvering while launching additional Zero fighters to reinforce the combat air patrol, creating exactly the kind of tactical situation that made ordnance changes both more difficult and more dangerous. The first American attack began at 0710 hours when 6 Navy Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 Army Air Force's Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers approached the Japanese formation at low altitude, their crews displaying the kind of desperate courage that would characterize American attacks throughout the morning as they pressed home their runs against overwhelming odds. The Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters of the Combat Air Patrol intercepted the attackers with devastating effect, their superior performance and experienced pilots resulting in the destruction of 5 Avengers and 2 Marauders, while the remaining aircraft fled toward Midway with battle damage. But the psychological impact on Japanese commanders was far greater than the physical damage inflicted on either side. Yamaguchi watched the engagement from Hiryu's bridge with growing frustration, recognizing that each successive attack disrupted the careful timing required for efficient carrier operations and delayed the completion of ordnance changes that were essential for launching effective strikes against American naval forces, should they appear. The presence of American aircraft over the Kido Butai meant that the element of surprise had been completely lost and that Japanese forces were now operating in a tactical environment where their opponents had initiative and could choose the timing and direction of their attacks. A fundamental reversal of the situation that Japanese planning had assumed would prevail throughout the operation. At 0728 hours, the tactical situation changed dramatically when Scout Plane No. 4 from the heavy cruiser tone transmitted a message that electrified the Japanese command structure. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships, in position bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway, course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. The report was both welcome and alarming. Welcome because it suggested that American naval forces were indeed responding to the Midway attack as Japanese planners had hoped, but alarming because the timing and location of the contact indicated that American commanders possessed far better intelligence about Japanese movements than had been assumed in operational planning. The presence of American surface ships within striking distance of the Kido Butai created an immediate requirement for more detailed reconnaissance to determine the composition of the enemy force and particularly to establish whether aircraft carriers were present, since the destruction of American carrier-based aviation was the primary strategic objective of the entire operation. Admiral Nagumo immediately transmitted an urgent message to the Tone Scout plane demanding clarification of ship types, while staff officers began calculating courses and speeds to determine how quickly American forces could close to within striking distance of the Japanese carriers, their urgent consultations reflecting the growing realization that the morning's events were not unfolding according to plan. Yamaguchi had already reached his own conclusion about the appropriate response to the contact report, his tactical instincts and aggressive temperament leading him to recommend immediate attacks on the American ships with whatever weapons were currently available, even if that meant using aircraft armed with land attack munitions rather than the anti-ship weapons that would be ideal for the mission. His assessment was that the opportunity to destroy American naval forces in the open ocean was too valuable to postpone while waiting for perfect conditions, and that the risks associated with improvised attacks were acceptable when weighed against the potential for decisive strategic results. But Admiral Nagumo faced a more complex decision matrix that included not only the immediate tactical situation, but also the broader strategic implications of committing his forces prematurely, or in less than optimal circumstances, his more cautious approach reflecting both his greater responsibility for the overall success of the operation and his awareness that the loss of the Kido Butai would effectively end Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific. The tension between aggressive action and prudent caution that characterized Japanese naval command decisions throughout the war was clearly visible in the debate that followed, as staff officers struggled to balance competing priorities and uncertain information. The scout plane's clarification, when it finally arrived, only increased the uncertainty rather than resolving it, as the pilot reported that the American force included what appears to be a carrier, but could not provide definitive identification or precise position information that would allow for accurate attack planning. The ambiguous nature of the report reflected both the limitations of single-engine float planes conducting reconnaissance at extreme range and the inherent difficulties of ship identification from high altitude, but the possibility of an American carrier in the area was sufficient to convince Nagumo that the reserve aircraft should be rearmed with anti-ship weapons regardless of the time required to complete the process. At 0745 hours, Admiral Nagumo issued the order to suspend ordnance changes and prepare the reserve aircraft for anti-ship attacks, a decision that created immediate chaos on the hangar decks of all four carriers as ordnance crews struggled to reverse the work they had already completed and begin installing the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs that had been removed earlier. The complexity of the situation was compounded by the continuing need to maintain combat air patrol operations and the requirement to prepare for the recovery of the First Strike Force, which was already returning from Midway and would need to land within the next hour, creating competing demands for flight deck space and crew attention. The Japanese carriers were thus caught in the worst possible tactical situation when the second wave of American attacks began arriving from Midway, with their hangars filled with partially armed aircraft, ordnance scattered across workspaces, and aviation fuel lines connected to aircraft that could not be quickly moved to safer locations. The vulnerability created by this situation was exactly what American doctrine hoped to achieve through coordinated attacks that would force enemy carriers to choose between offensive and defensive operations, but the timing of the American strikes was determined more by the availability of aircraft and the courage of their crews than by any sophisticated understanding of Japanese vulnerabilities. The Marine Corps fighter squadrons from Midway arrived over the Japanese formation at 0755 hours. 25 obsolete aircraft including 20 Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and 5 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters, attempting to engage the vastly superior Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters that had been reinforced to deal with the continuing series of American attacks. The resulting air battle was a massacre in which Japanese pilots shot down 13 American fighters while losing only 2 of their own aircraft. But the psychological impact on Japanese commanders was far greater than the tactical results would suggest, as the continuing presence of American aircraft over the Kido Butai demonstrated that enemy forces retained significant striking capability despite the morning's bombing attacks. Major Lofton Henderson led 16 Marine Corps Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers in attacks on the Japanese carriers at 0805 hours. His squadron diving through intense anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighter attacks in a desperate attempt to inflict damage on the enemy formation, but the inexperience of Marine Corps pilots in carrier attack techniques and the overwhelming Japanese defensive firepower resulted in the loss of half the attacking aircraft with no significant damage to any Japanese ships. Henderson himself was killed during the attack, his aircraft shot down by a Zero fighter as he attempted to line up on the carrier Hiryu, but his sacrifice would be commemorated when the main airfield at Guadalcanal was named Henderson Field in his honor. Yamaguchi observed the attacks from Hiryu's bridge with mixed emotions, professional admiration for the courage displayed by American aircrews combined with frustration at the delays being imposed on Japanese operations and growing concern about the tactical implications of continued enemy air activity over the carrier force. Each successive attack required evasive maneuvering that disrupted formation integrity and made it more difficult to coordinate the complex operations required for efficient air group management, while the need to maintain strong combat air patrol coverage reduced the number of aircraft available for offensive missions against newly discovered American surface forces. At 0830 hours, 15 Army Air Force's Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers attempted to attack the Japanese carriers from high altitude, their crews displaying the same desperate courage that had characterized earlier attacks, but their aircraft poorly suited for the precision required to hit maneuvering ships at sea. The B-17s dropped their bombs from 20,000 feet in level flight attacks that had virtually no chance of success against fast-moving targets. But the presence of American heavy bombers over the Kido Butai created additional psychological pressure on Japanese commanders while forcing continued evasive maneuvering that interfered with ongoing preparations for strikes against American naval forces. The recovery of the First Strike Force began at 0837 hours as Lieutenant Commander Tomonaga's aircraft began returning from their attacks on Midway, their pilots reporting significant damage to enemy installations but also describing continued American air activity and stronger than expected defensive reactions. The process of landing aircraft on carrier flight decks required precise coordination and careful timing under the best of circumstances, but the continuing presence of American aircraft in the area forced Japanese carriers to maintain evasive maneuvering throughout the recovery process, creating exactly the kind of complex operational environment that increased the risk of accidents and reduced overall efficiency. The tactical situation reached crisis proportions when Tominaga himself reported that his aircraft had been damaged by anti-aircraft fire during the attack on Midway, and that his fuel tanks were leaking, creating an emergency that required immediate landing priority while also highlighting the continued capability of American defenses despite the morning's bombing attacks. The sight of battle-damaged aircraft returning with wounded aircrew members provided visible evidence that the enemy was far from defeated and retained significant capability to interfere with Japanese operations, contradicting intelligence estimates that had predicted minimal resistance to the carrier strikes. Yamaguchi's frustration with the morning's events was clearly visible to his staff officers as he paced the bridge of Hiryu, his aggressive temperament chafing at the defensive posture that had been imposed on the Kido Butai by the continuing series of American attacks and the requirements for complex ordnance changes that prevented immediate strikes against newly discovered enemy naval forces. His tactical instincts told him that the initiative was slipping away from Japanese forces and that decisive action was required to regain control of the tactical situation. But the decision-making authority rested with Admiral Nagumo aboard the flagship Akagi, and Nagumo's more cautious approach reflected his greater responsibility for the safety of Japan's most valuable naval assets. The morning's pattern of American attacks culminated at 0920 hours when torpedo squadrons from the 3 American aircraft carriers arrived over the Japanese formation in 3 separate waves. 41 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers approaching at low altitude in coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer numbers and determination. The obsolete American torpedo bombers were no match for the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the Japanese formation, but their crews pressed home their attacks with suicidal courage that impressed even their enemies, continuing their runs despite devastating losses that would leave only 6 of the 41 aircraft able to return to their carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet was completely destroyed in its attack on the Japanese formation. All 15 aircraft shot down with only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, who was rescued by American forces the following day after spending 30 hours floating in the Pacific Ocean, his survival providing the only first-hand American account of the devastating effectiveness of Japanese defensive measures. The squadron's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had predicted the likely outcome of the attack during his pre-flight briefing, telling his pilots that, if only one plane is left, I want that man to go in and get a hit. A directive that his squadron followed to the letter as they died one by one attempting to reach their targets. The destruction of the American torpedo squadrons represented a tactical victory for Japanese forces, but the strategic implications were far more complex, as the attacks had forced the Kido Butai to maintain defensive formations and evasive maneuvering for more than 3 hours, preventing the completion of ordnance changes and the launch of strikes against American naval forces. More importantly, the low-altitude attacks had drawn the majority of Japanese Zero fighters down to sea level, where they were engaged in pursuing and destroying the torpedo bombers, leaving the high-altitude approaches to the carrier formation relatively undefended at the precise moment when American dive bombers were beginning their attacks. Yamaguchi was studying intelligence reports in Hiryu's Combat Information Center when the air raid alarm sounded at 1022 hours, indicating the approach of enemy aircraft from a direction and altitude that had not been detected by the visual observation network that Japanese forces relied upon for early warning. The lack of radar aboard Japanese ships meant that attacking aircraft could approach undetected until they were spotted by lookouts, and the concentration of Zero fighters at low altitude pursuing torpedo bombers had created exactly the kind of defensive gap that American doctrine was designed to exploit through coordinated attacks using different types of aircraft and varying approach altitudes. The American dive bombers that appeared over the Japanese formation at 1022 hours represented the most dangerous threat that carrier forces could face, aircraft approaching from high altitude at high speed with the capability to place large bombs directly onto flight decks and hangar decks with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led 37 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carrier Enterprise in attacks on the carriers Kaga and Akagi, while 17 additional Dauntless bombers from the carrier Yorktown targeted the carrier Soryu, their pilots having trained extensively in the precise timing and coordination required for effective dive bombing attacks against moving targets. The 5 minutes that followed would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, as American dive bombers achieved the kind of tactical surprise that Japanese forces had inflicted on their enemies at Pearl Harbor and throughout the 6 months of Pacific conquest that had established Japan's maritime empire. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were struck by multiple bombs within the space of minutes, their hangars filled with fueled and armed aircraft, creating the perfect conditions for the catastrophic secondary explosions that would doom all three ships despite desperate damage control efforts by their crews. Yamaguchi watched in horrified fascination from Hiryu's bridge as explosions and fires erupted across the formation. The sight of three fleet carriers burning simultaneously representing a tactical disaster of unprecedented magnitude that effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations in the Pacific, though the full strategic implications would not become apparent until later analysis revealed the irreplaceable nature of the losses in both ships and trained personnel. The speed and coordination of the American attacks demonstrated a level of tactical competence that contradicted intelligence estimates of enemy capabilities, while the precision of the bombing suggested that American pilots possessed far more training and experience than Japanese planners had assumed. The destruction of 3/4 of the Kido Butai within minutes created an immediate crisis for Japanese naval strategy that extended far beyond the tactical situation at Midway, as the loss of so many fleet carriers represented the elimination of Japan's primary tool for projecting naval power across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean, reducing the Imperial Navy's offensive capability to a level that could not support continued expansion or even the defense of existing conquests. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to professional naval officers like Yamaguchi, who understood that the war had fundamentally changed character in the space of 5 minutes and that Japan's position in the Pacific had shifted from offensive dominance to defensive desperation. But Yamaguchi's immediate concern was not strategic analysis but tactical response, as Hiryu remained undamaged and capable of conducting offensive operations against the American carriers that had inflicted such devastating losses on the Kido Butai. His aggressive temperament and tactical training both demanding immediate action to salvage what remained possible from the morning's disasters. The opportunity for revenge existed if Hiryu could locate and attack the American carriers before they could launch additional strikes, and Yamaguchi's staff officers were already preparing flight plans and target assignments for the counterattack that might restore some balance to the tactical situation. The first strike from Hiryu launched at 1,100 hours with 18 Aichi D3A dive bombers escorted by 6 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi leading the formation toward the last known position of American carrier forces, while Yamaguchi remained on the bridge to coordinate follow-up attacks and maintain communications with Admiral Nagumo, who had transferred his flag from the burning Akagi to the light cruiser Nagara and was attempting to maintain command and control over the scattered remnants of the Kido Butai. The sight of his own aircraft departing on offensive missions provided some relief from the psychological shock of the morning's losses, though Yamaguchi understood that the tactical situation had fundamentally changed and that Japanese forces were now operating from a position of severe disadvantage. The strike force had been airborne for less than an hour when radio reports indicated contact with American fighters, the engagement developing into exactly the kind of running air battle that favored the superior numbers and performance of American aircraft, particularly when Japanese formations had been reduced by the morning's losses and could no longer provide the kind of mutual support that characterized effective carrier operations. Lieutenant Kobayashi's transmission of enemy fighters approaching was followed by increasingly urgent combat reports as his formation was intercepted by Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters from the American carriers, the superior numbers and coordinated tactics of the defending aircraft quickly reducing the Japanese strike force to a handful of aircraft still capable of continuing the attack. Despite the losses inflicted during the approach, 8 Japanese dive bombers succeeded in reaching the American carrier Yorktown and scored 3 direct hits that caused significant damage and forced the ship to reduce speed, their accuracy demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Japanese naval aviation even under the adverse conditions that now characterized the tactical situation. The success of the attack provided some satisfaction to Yamaguchi and his staff, who had feared that the morning's disasters might have completely eliminated Japanese striking capability, but the cost in aircraft and trained aircrew was far higher than could be sustained over any extended period of operations. The second strike from Hiryu launched at 1,331 hours with 10 Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters. Lieutenant Chuichi Nagumo leading the formation despite his aircraft having been damaged during the morning attack on Midway, and his fuel tanks leaking aviation gasoline at a rate that would make return to the carrier impossible. Tominaga's decision to lead the attack despite knowing it was a one-way mission epitomized the spirit of self-sacrifice that characterized Japanese naval aviation, but it also represented the kind of irreplaceable loss in experienced leadership that would cripple Japan's ability to train replacement aircrew for future operations. The torpedo attack achieved complete surprise against the American formation, as the damaged Yorktown had been mistaken for an undamaged carrier and the Japanese aircrew believed they were attacking a fresh target rather than the same ship that had been damaged by the earlier dive-bombing attack. Two Type 91 aerial torpedoes struck Yorktown on her port side, causing flooding and a severe list that forced the abandonment of the ship, though she would remain afloat until sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later, her destruction representing the only major American loss of the battle and a small measure of revenge for the morning's catastrophic losses. But the strategic situation remained fundamentally unchanged despite the successful attacks on Yorktown, as the American force still included 2 undamaged fleet carriers with full air groups capable of conducting additional strikes against Japanese forces, while Hiryu's aircraft strength had been reduced to the point where continued offensive operations were no longer possible without accepting casualties that would eliminate the remaining trained aircrew. Yamaguchi faced the bitter reality that his aggressive temperament and tactical skills could not overcome the mathematical impossibility of conducting effective carrier operations with insufficient aircraft and aircrew, particularly when operating against an enemy force that retained overwhelming numerical superiority. The American response to the Japanese attacks came at 1,705 hours when 24 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown appeared over Hiryu, their approach having been guided by scout aircraft that had located the last Japanese carrier and provided accurate position reports to American commanders. The sight of American dive bombers beginning their attacks created the same sense of helpless inevitability that had characterized the morning's disasters, as Yamaguchi and his crew prepared to experience the same fate that had befallen their sister ships earlier in the day. The attack on Hiryu was characterized by the same precision and coordination that had destroyed the other 3 Japanese carriers, with American dive bombers scoring 4 direct hits that started fires throughout the ship and quickly reduced her to the same condition as Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, her flight deck wrecked and her hangar spaces filled with burning aircraft and exploding ammunition. The speed with which the fires spread demonstrated the inherent vulnerability of aircraft carriers to bomb damage, particularly when their hangars contained fueled and armed aircraft that created the conditions for catastrophic secondary explosions. Yamaguchi's response to the destruction of his flagship reflected both his personal code of honor and the cultural traditions that govern Japanese naval service, as he rejected suggestions that he transfer to an escorting destroyer and instead chose to remain aboard Hiryu to share the fate of his ship and his crew. Captain Tomio Kaku made the same decision, and together they gathered the survivors on the flight deck for a final ceremony that included expressions of loyalty to the emperor, the singing of the national anthem, and the lowering of the battle flag, their actions epitomizing the spirit of self-sacrifice that characterized Japanese military culture throughout the war. The final message transmitted from Hiryu reflected Yamaguchi's assessment of the tactical and strategic situation. His recommendation to Admiral Nagumo that the remaining surface forces should attempt to engage American naval units in a night surface action representing his final effort to salvage something from the day's disasters through the kind of close-range gun battle at which Japanese forces excelled. The suggestion demonstrated his continued aggressive mindset even in the face of overwhelming defeat, but the tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where such desperate measures were unlikely to achieve significant results against an enemy force that retained overwhelming superiority in both numbers and position. At 0510 hours on June 5, the destroyer Makigumo fired torpedoes into the blazing hulk of Hiryu to prevent her capture by American forces, the final destruction of the last Japanese carrier representing the end of the Kido Butai as an effective fighting force and the beginning of a new phase of the Pacific War in which Japan would be forced into an increasingly defensive posture. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Kaku went down with their ship, their deaths representing not only personal tragedies but strategic losses for the Imperial Navy, which could not afford to lose experienced commanders at a time when the training of replacements was becoming increasingly difficult due to resource constraints and the pressure of continuous operations. The aftermath of the battle would reveal the full magnitude of the Japanese defeat, with the loss of 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and 248 aircraft representing the elimination of Japan's primary tool for offensive operations in the Pacific, while the death of 3,057 Japanese sailors and airmen included hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft maintenance specialists whose skills could not be quickly replaced through normal training programs. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical losses, as the destruction of the Kido Butai effectively ended Japan's ability to conduct the kind of coordinated multi-carrier operations that had characterized their success during the first 6 months of the Pacific War. American forces had demonstrated not only superior intelligence gathering through their success in breaking Japanese naval codes, but also superior tactical execution through their coordinated dive bombing attacks that achieved the kind of devastating surprise that had previously been the hallmark of Japanese operations, the reversal of tactical fortunes reflecting both the inherent vulnerabilities of carrier operations and the growing competence of American naval aviation. The battle had also revealed critical weaknesses in Japanese carrier design and operational procedures, particularly the practice of storing aircraft in hangars rather than on flight decks, and the lack of radar and effective damage control systems that might have reduced the vulnerability of carriers to bomb damage. The loss of so many experienced aircrew would prove even more strategically significant than the loss of the carriers themselves, as Japan's training programs could not replace skilled pilots at a rate sufficient to maintain the quality of naval aviation that had characterized the Kido Butai. The shortage of experienced instructors and the pressure of wartime operations combining to create a downward spiral in pilot quality that would become increasingly apparent in subsequent battles. The mathematical impossibility of replacing experienced aircrew at wartime loss rates would force Japan into increasingly desperate expedients, including the use of barely trained pilots in combat roles and eventually the systematic use of suicide attacks as a substitute for conventional bombing and torpedo attacks. The Battle of Midway thus represented not only a tactical defeat for Japanese forces but a fundamental shift in the strategic balance of the Pacific War. The destruction of Japan's premier naval aviation force, marking the beginning of a defensive phase that would culminate in the invasion of the Japanese home islands 3 years later, the path from offensive dominance to defensive collapse having been determined in the space of 5 minutes on the morning of June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers achieved the kind of tactical surprise that Japanese forces had inflicted on their enemies at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. For Admiral Yamaguchi, the battle had represented both the pinnacle and the end of a naval career that had embodied the aggressive spirit and tactical competence that characterized Japanese naval aviation during its period of greatest success. His death aboard Hiryu symbolizing both the personal cost of military service and the strategic impossibility of maintaining offensive operations against an enemy whose industrial capacity and tactical competence had proven superior to earlier intelligence estimates. The 5 minutes that destroyed 3 Japanese carriers had effectively ended not only the battle but Japan's hopes for victory in the Pacific War, the mathematical realities of industrial production and pilot training making eventual defeat inevitable once the strategic initiative had passed to American forces. The radio silence that settled over the Central Pacific as the last Japanese transmissions faded into static marked the end of Japan's brief period of naval supremacy and the beginning of a long retreat that would see the systematic reduction of the maritime empire that had been built through 6 months of uninterrupted victory, the wreckage of 4 fleet carriers on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean serving as monuments to both the courage of their crews and the ultimate futility of challenging an enemy whose resources and determination had been severely underestimated by Japanese strategic planning. In the end, the Battle of Midway had revealed not only the tactical vulnerabilities of carrier operations but the strategic impossibility of maintaining offensive campaigns against an industrial democracy whose capacity for war production and military innovation would prove superior to anything the Japanese Empire could sustain over the long term.